Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Portage Lakes after midnight is quiet enough that small details stand out. On June 20th, 2012, a late order came into a Domino's store near the plaza. Delivery requested to the rear entrance of a closed business in New Franklin, Ohio. The instructions sounded routine to the caller. To a night driver, it meant walking into a dark service lane with limited sightlines. 25-year-old Ashley Biggs, an Army veteran and young mother, took the run. She followed policy, park clear of the doorway, keep the car visible from the road, make it quick. She did not check back in. Inside the store, the time window for a normal drop elapsed. Staff tried her cell and got nothing. A supervisor traced the route and located her expected stop behind the shuttered building. The lot was dark, the door secured, and there were signs something had gone wrong. Blood evidence on the ground and indications of a struggle. Patrol responded and detectives locked the area as Scene 1. There was no body at the lot. That distinction mattered, and they wrote it that way. Procedurally, the first hour set the tone. Officers cleared the immediate area, logged vehicles, and protected footwear impressions and small transfers before the surface could be contaminated by responders. A unit canvassed adjacent businesses for any exterior cameras that might cover the service lane. Another officer documented lighting and obstructions, angles that would show how much a person approaching that door could be seen from the street. In cases like this, you don't chase theories, you sequence the facts, the order, the route, the timeline, what belonged here and what didn't. Detectives questioned store staff about recent unusual requests, caller accents, and whether deliver to the back was common for that address. The manager pulled the ticket and matched it to the point of sale log, time-stamped, marked to a false name, and handwritten with rear door. That note would matter later, not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific. If someone designed the approach, they wanted isolation. No lobby lights, no passing customers, no open front windows. By policy, the case scaled from a late driver to a likely assault. Communications notified neighboring jurisdictions to watch for a vehicle matching Ashley's. Detectives began the parallel track that often breaks these cases: telephony, call logs from the store, the time window when her phone last registered activity, any outbound attempts from her line. The goal wasn't to identify a suspect in hour 1. It was to fix a clock the rest of the investigation could not bend. The data aligned too cleanly, one investigator would later remark. Sometimes that was the problem. For viewers who work nights, the details here are practical, not theatrical. Closed businesses create blind spots. Rear doors cut you off from the sight lines of the road. If someone wants to control where you stand, they dictate where you deliver. That's not fear, that's procedure. By sunrise, the question was no longer whether something had happened behind that building. The evidence on the asphalt said it had. The question became where the driver was now and how far the case would travel before it came back to this exact spot and the ticket that sent her here. Morning broke on June 21st, 2012 with a single operational priority: locate the missing driver and lock her timeline. Search teams working the Akron suburbs extended beyond the New Franklin lot. The expansion made sense. If the assault happened behind a closed business, the recovery would likely be elsewhere. By late morning, in a field in Chippewa Township, Wayne County, Ohio, a ground unit reported a body consistent with the missing 25-year-old Ashley Biggs. The discovery created a second discrete scene and a new chain of custody tree. From that minute forward, nothing moved without a signature. Command split responsibilities. Summit County investigators kept custody of Scene 1, the rear lot in New Franklin. Wayne County took lead on Scene 2, the field. A joint log tracked every item, who found it, when it was photographed, bagged, and transferred. The field perimeter was set wide to protect trace material. A single ingress-egress path was marked so first responders didn't overwrite latent impressions. In places like the Akron suburbs, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community, and the only way to hold that fabric together is disciplined procedure. The condition of the recovery site mattered. There was no evidence of a prolonged struggle in the field. That supports one conclusion without guessing motive. The primary assault occurred elsewhere. Weather, soil, and vegetation were documented because each affects what evidence can be recovered and what cannot. Biological samples were prioritized then screened and preserved for lab work. Any nearby tire or footwear impressions were photographed with scale markers. If they were partial, they were still recorded. A dedicated evidence tech handled the victim's clothing and personal effects to avoid cross-contamination with the New Franklin lot. 2 scenes, 2 evidence streams, 1 timeline. A coroner's investigator attended the field exam. Formal cause and manner would come later from the autopsy, but the on-scene assessment supported homicide. The external survey noted signs consistent with strangulation. Exact implement and sequence were reserved for the postmortem, which would be conducted under the appropriate county authority and shared with Summit County under interagency protocols. That restraint was deliberate. You don't rush conclusions that will be tested in court. Back at the New Franklin lot, crime scene techs rechecked the corridor between the parking surface and the delivery door, aligning measurements with the new time of discovery in Wayne County. If transport occurred, distances and drive times had to match what the call logs and traffic conditions would later show. The first chapter established the engineered delivery. This chapter fixes the geography. Assault site, New Franklin, recovery site, Chippewa Township. The data aligned too cleanly. And sometimes that was the problem. The missing person posture officially converted to a homicide investigation with a 2-jurisdiction footprint. That triggers a specific set of tasks. Designate a primary case number, assign a single evidence custodian per scene, and ensure witness canvases are not duplicated. Officers in Wayne County performed a field-to-road survey to determine the most likely access point used to enter and exit the property. If a vehicle brought the victim there, it had options. Those options were mapped for later comparison to known routes from the lot. Meanwhile, Summit County continued to canvass businesses near the closed storefront for any angle of the rear lane, even if the camera's field of view was partial or infrared only. Forensic value isn't always a perfect picture. Sometimes it's a shadow, a headlight sweep, or a timestamp. The human component stayed present but measured. Notifications to family were handled by trained personnel with a focus on clarity and support. For viewers who work in delivery, rideshare, or third-shift logistics, the practical point is simple. Close business rear doors or blind spots. Agencies can redesign patrol patterns and businesses can add lighting, but situational choices, where you park, what you can see, how quickly you exit, remain first-line safety. That isn't drama, it's survival. With 2 scenes stabilized, the case could now move to synthesis. The next steps would press the timeline from both ends. Store systems and call records on one side, post-mortem findings on the other. When those meet, the window for speculation narrows. We will not name a killer here. The investigation has more work to do. But the scaffolding is in place. An engineered delivery, an assault site with physical evidence, a recovery site that confirms homicide, and a jurisdictional plan that keeps the facts intact from here to trial. The purpose of this phase was simple. Understand the victim's routine and identify who could have anticipated it. Ashley Biggs, 25, was not a nameless driver on a random shift. She was a former U.S. Army fuel specialist, a young mother, and a reliable closer on late nights at the Portage Lake store. Supervisors described her as punctual and policy-minded. She kept her head down, got the food out, and came back on time. When that pattern breaks, investigators don't debate possibilities. They audit knowledge. Who knew she was working, who could predict her path, and who had a reason to funnel her to the back of a closed business. Detectives began with verifiable structure. They pulled the roster and time cards for the week of June 18 to 24, 2012, then cross-checked the closing rotation. A delivery driver taking a late ticket isn't random. It's dictated by who is on the board when the call comes in, who just returned, and who has the fewest pending runs. They reconstructed that wheel turn by turn. They reviewed dispatch tickets from the prior 2 weeks to establish whether back-of-building drops for that address were normal or unusual. They asked a narrow question. Did the caller exploit a pattern unique to that location, or simply choose a blind spot any driver would treat as routine? Next, they mapped who had legitimate visibility into Ashley's schedule. Store managers, shift leads, peers on the line, and regular customers who knew the late staff by name. They pulled contact lists for last-minute shift trades. They logged any recent friction at the store, disputes, complaints, or customers who had previously pushed for odd instructions. They also documented personal connections, that could overlap with work, family, close friends, past relationships. That wasn't a shortcut to a suspect. It was a boundary check. Knowledge can be innocent. But in cases that hinge on a specific instruction, rear door of a closed business, investigators have to decide whether that directive relied on casual familiarity or insider precision. The team conducted a route vulnerability review. They returned to scene 1 in daylight to record line-of-sight data from the service lane to the roadway. They measured how far a driver would be from public view when standing at the rear threshold, how long a standard handoff would take, and how quickly a person could be moved off that pad and out of the camera angles most small businesses actually maintain, usually above the front door, not the back. They noted that Ashley parked with her vehicle visible from the street. That's policy. It did not negate the isolation created by the door placement and the building's footprint. Parallel to fieldwork, a digital team prepared subpoenas for call detail records, CDRs, relevant to the store's landline and the narrowed time window. That belongs to the next chapter's evidentiary push, but the foundation was laid here. Capture the store log, preserve the exact timestamp, and lock the metadata before memories or systems roll over. They also preserved Ashley's employment profile, shift start and projected end, known break patterns, and any known calls or texts during the shift, so that later lab findings could be correlated to practical windows when she would have been en route, at the rear door, or no longer able to respond. The question of who knew Ashley's route wasn't answered by rumor. Interviews were short and focused. What did you see? What did you hear? What did you handle at the store when that order came in? Did anyone comment on the address or the rear door instruction? Investigators asked whether staff remembered similar calls to that location. They queried whether a repeat customer ever insisted on backlane handoffs. They documented answers in a consistent format so contradictions could be tested against logs rather than impressions. The personal profile mattered, but it was handled with care. Ashley's service background, her role as a mother, and a known custody dispute in her life were noted as context, not conclusion. In American investigations, motive is built after means and opportunity. You don't litigate a relationship file in the first week. You determine whether the crime's mechanics required specialized knowledge. Here, the mechanics suggested planning. The order used a false name and channeled a driver to one of the least visible points on the property. That makes knowledge mapping, not speculation, the operative task. There was also a safety lens. Delivery work at night isn't inherently unsafe. It becomes unsafe when a caller dictates terrain that defeats ordinary protections. This case pushed that reminder into policy notes that outlive any single investigation. Don't normalize backdoor requests at closed businesses, require a second employee on those runs, add lighting where the public can see the handoff. These choices aren't commentary, they are direct responses to a tactic that cost a worker her life. By the end of this phase, the board looked different. The case was no longer a missing driver with blood at a lot and a body in a field. It was a structured map. Who could place an order at that time? Who could anticipate Ashley would take it? And who understood how little light and cover there would be at that rear threshold? The narrative remains disciplined. No names here, no allegations, no shortcuts. The next chapter turns to the numbers, store systems, call metadata, and the first witness developments that begin to give the lure a voice. The next move wasn't guesswork. Investigators went straight to systems that record without bias. The point-of-sale console, the store's phone logs, and the carrier's call detail records. The delivery ticket that sent Ashley Biggs behind a closed address was pulled first. It showed the exact time the order was entered, the items requested, and a handwritten note. Rear door. That wasn't dramatic, it was specific. Next to it, the store's inbound call list showed a short call in the same window, consistent with placing an order. The caller name attached to the ticket was false. Whether caller ID appeared on the console didn't matter. Carriers retain origin numbers in their own logs. Subpoenas went out before business opened. The audit had 3 parts. First, confirm the order's timestamp and duration from the carrier's records and match them to the point-of-sale time to the minute. Second, determine the origin number and the handset or line subscriber tied to it. Third, understand the call path, where it connected from, how long it rang, whether it was redialed. Once you fix those 3 points, everything else either supports the story or contradicts it. The board inside the investigation room changed from names to times. Call placed, ticket printed, driver assigned, driver departs, estimated arrival at the service entrance. Assignment mattered. On late nights, who takes a ticket is shaped by who's back from a run and who is staged. The roster for June 20th, 2012 showed Ashley in rotation to handle that next dispatch. Management confirmed she'd been punctual that night. The window between the order time and the expected handoff aligned with the distance to the rear threshold. None of that named a caller, but it narrowed what a caller would have needed to know. Either the person understood the store's rhythms and expected any driver to comply with a backdoor request at a closed site, or the person had some visibility into who would likely be on that run. The difference is subtle in conversation, critical in court. With the subpoenas issued, investigators prepped a parallel set of asks that often decide these cases. If the origin number belonged to a prepaid or a handset not registered to a subscriber, the carrier still holds metadata, tower hits, call history, and in some circumstances, a device identifier. That would take time. While the paperwork moved, detectives returned to the humans who handled the call. The employee who took the order recalled the voice as adult, female, calm, and insistent about the back entrance. No flourish, just deliver to the back. That recollection was memorialized in a sworn statement with careful qualifiers, remembered details, not absolute claims. Two witness developments began to surface as the record's work advanced. A juvenile in a connected household later described overhearing an adult woman place a late-night pizza order under a name that wasn't hers, matching the service entrance instruction. The statement was time-bounded and taken with guardians present. Separately, a relative produced a recording made prior to the homicide investigation that referenced a phone order and post-offense cleanup talk. Chain of custody for that recording was documented from the moment the relative turned it over. Neither development alone proved who stood in the service lane that night. Together with call records and the ticket, they gave the lure a voice. The store's call log showed no repeat orders to that closed address in the weeks prior. That pattern matters. If a location routinely asks for backdoor drops, a caller can hide inside the routine. If it doesn't, the instruction stands out. Investigators compared that finding to the earlier route vulnerability review, limited sightlines, poor lighting, and a door that kept a driver out of view from passing traffic. The order didn't accidentally exploit a blind spot. It dictated one. Every new fact was cross-checked against the recovery in Chippewa Township the following morning. Drive time from the new Franklin lot to the field was measured during comparable hours. The ticket's clock gave a latest safe arrival estimate. The body discovery fixed a hard stop at the other end. As the autopsy request moved forward, the phone records became the faster lever. When the carrier returned the call, origin. Detectives expected one of two outcomes, either a subscriber with a paper trail or a number designed to vanish. What came back would determine the next set of interviews, and later, how prosecutors framed facilitation and planning. Cases like this carry a human point that goes beyond the spreadsheet. A voice on a phone can move a worker into danger with a single instruction. Good policy, two-person verifications for rear entrance drops, better lighting, and clear opt-out authority for drivers reduces that risk. It doesn't erase intent. The best way to honor a victim is to treat the data with the same seriousness as the loss, so nothing collapses later under challenge. Near the end of this phase, the timeline was tight enough to test. The store's inbound call aligned with the POS ticket. The driver rotation explained why Ashley took the run. The route window matched the distance to the rear threshold, and the lack of struggle at the field supported the conclusion that the primary assault happened at the lot. The juvenile statement and the recording were documented and preserved, not used as shortcuts. What remained was to connect the method to the caller and the caller to anyone who helped execute the plan. That next step would be built on forensics, not speculation. One investigator summed up the posture of the case this way, and it's worth keeping. The numbers don't point to motive, but they do point to design. If the service entrance was chosen to control the handoff, then the person who chose it engineered more than a delivery. They engineered the crime scene. The next phase answered the how. The medical examiner and crime scene teams worked from opposite ends of the same line, one from the recovery site and autopsy, the other from the new Franklin service entrance. Their conclusions met in the middle and set the mechanics of this homicide in place. At the field in Chippewa Township, the body recovery was documented with wide-angle and scale photography, then packaged for transport. There were no signs of a prolonged fight in that grass, no churned soil, no drag trench that would argue for a struggle there. That observation did not explain motive. It fixed location. The assault happened elsewhere, consistent with the blood evidence already preserved behind the closed business in New Franklin. The autopsy focused on timing and cause. External examination recorded multiple injuries consistent with control before death, including marks indicative of a conducted electrical weapon. Neck findings pointed to ligature strangulation, a narrow, band-like abrasion with characteristics consistent with a plastic zip tie. Petechial hemorrhages supported that conclusion. Internal examination did not suggest manual strangulation. The pattern fit a tightened ligature. The cause of death was certified as strangulation. The manner was homicide. That ruling anchored the scene work back at the service entrance. Technicians mapped approach and exit paths a second time with the autopsy window in mind. If a stun device was used to overwhelm a target at the door, an offender needed seconds, not minutes, to force control and move the victim from open view. The lot geometry allowed it. Sight lines from the roadway were poor at the rear threshold. A vehicle pulled tight to the building could load fast and leave without a passerby noticing more than headlights turning. Contact traces were handled with a strict chain. Swabs were taken from the rear threshold, door hardware, and areas of apparent transfer. Shoe impressions that survived overnight humidity were photographed with forensic scales and lifted if viable. Fiber and tape lifts were collected from surfaces at reach height. None of those items named a suspect by themselves. They built a catalog that the lab could test against known standards later in the case. Movement analysis tied the two scenes together. Investigators drove the route from the rear lot to the field at comparable nighttime hours to record realistic travel times. Those times were overlaid on the call-to-ticket-to-departure sequence already established from store systems. The window was tight and consistent with a planned transport rather than improvisation. That matters in court. Planning is a different legal argument than spontaneity. The medical findings also set the order of operations. Control first, then ligature, then transport. When the body was examined, the indicators of electrical control were present but not severe. They read like compliance, not an extended struggle. The ligature pattern told the rest of the story. A zip tie is narrow, fast, and unforgiving. It leaves a distinct mark and requires intent to apply and tighten. That is not an accident of a fall or a misapplied hold. It is a decision. Back at the lot, the team re-examined the vehicle staging area. Where would an offender park to minimize exposure and still make a quick load? Which angles defeated the front-facing cameras of adjacent businesses? Measurements from the threshold to those blind spots were logged, along with light readings taken at the same hour of night. In the Akron suburbs, murders aren't just crimes. They put real pressure on simple assumptions about safety. Good lighting helps. It does not erase a plan built to exploit a blind spot. None of this was theater. Each step protected the eventual presentation to a jury. Here is the assault site, here is the recovery site, here is how we know where the killing occurred, here is the method that caused death, and here is how long it likely took to move from one location to the other. The numbers were clean. That can be reassuring, but it can also tempt investigators to stop asking hard questions. They didn't. Every inference was matched to a measurement. Autopsy timing to travel time, wound pattern to the control device indicators, and site geometry to the feasibility of a fast abduction from the door. The human reality did not get lost. A worker answered a phone order and was met by force designed to remove choice. That is why procedural details matter. They reduce speculation. They keep the story of what happened anchored to facts that cross-check. By the end of this phase, the case had a stable spine, engineered delivery, assault and control at the New Franklin service entrance, ligature strangulation by zip tie, transport to the field in Wayne County. The next step was to connect those mechanics to the person who placed the call and to any person who acted alongside the killer. That connection would come from the lab reports, device records, and later testimony. The method was set. The question of who applied it was next. By the time the lab reports, timelines, and autopsy were aligned, prosecutors had enough to charge the killer who carried out the attack at the service entrance in New Franklin and moved the body to a field in Chippewa Township. In 2013, that defendant stood in an Ohio courtroom and entered a guilty plea to aggravated murder and related counts. The proceeding was straightforward. The judge confirmed competency, voluntariness, and factual basis. The defendant acknowledged the elements of the offense. The record accepted the plea and imposed life without the possibility of parole. No sentencing theatrics, just a permanent result. A plea like this locks facts that matter later. It concedes the engineered encounter at the rear threshold, the use of a control device before death, the ligature strangulation, and the transport that followed. It also acknowledges what the evidence already showed. The primary assault happened at scene 1, not in the field. Travel time tests and phone-to-ticket timing stood up. The method was consistent with the autopsy. In legal terms, the mechanics of the homicide were no longer in dispute. The person who did it admitted it. But a guilty plea can draw a clean line without finishing the picture. This one did not identify the voice that placed the order to the service entrance, and it did not resolve whether anyone else helped plan the lure or the aftermath. Prosecutors made that distinction clear then and in the filings that followed. The plea closed the question of who killed Ashley Biggs. It did not close the question of who facilitated the setup that brought her to that door. For families, a resolution like this avoids the trauma of a full capital trial, the uncertainty of appeals on guilt, and the risk that a jury could hang. For investigators, it preserves bandwidth to pursue any secondary actor without splitting focus. The evidence already has a spine. Ticket time stamps matched to carrier records, scene geometry that explains how control was taken quickly at the rear threshold, autopsy findings that certify ligature strangulation, and a tight window to move from Summit County to Wayne County before daybreak. A plea turns that spine into a stable platform for the next phase. There's a broader point here, and it goes to safety as much as law. When a killer admits the mechanics of the crime, the most useful thing a community can take forward is not fear, it's policy. Don't normalize rear entrance drops at closed sites. Give workers clear authority to refuse unsafe instructions. If an order dictates a blind spot, that's not customer convenience, it's risk. Ashley deserved better than a phone script designed to isolate her. What remains for us, and for the case at this stage, is narrow and important. Tie the phone order to a person and test whether that person acted alone. The record now has room for that work because the plea did what it was supposed to do: fix the facts of the killing and keep the case moving toward full accountability. With the killer's plea securing the facts of the assault and transport, prosecutors turned to the voice on the phone. In November 2019, a Summit County grand jury indicted Erica Stefanko on charges including aggravated murder, and related counts premised on planning and facilitation. The theory was direct. The lure call that sent Ashley Biggs to a rear service entrance at a closed address was not a quirk of late-night business. It was an act that set the homicide in motion. Pre-trial work tightened the chain already built in this case. The point-of-sale timestamp matched carrier call detail records. The store's inbound list placed a short, late-night order under a false name. The route window aligned with the distance to the rear threshold. Prosecutors added 2 developments that had been documented and preserved: a juvenile witness who reported overhearing an adult woman place a late-night pizza order using a name that wasn't hers, and a relative's recording referencing a phone order and post-offense cleanup talk. Chain of custody for both items was built step by step. None of this overwrote the 2013 plea. It complemented it, giving the lure a specific, testable origin. Trial began in 2020 under pandemic restrictions. The courtroom looked different: distancing, masks, and plexiglass. But the evidentiary structure stayed familiar: phones, logs, and witnesses. The state led with the systems that do not forget, then moved to the people who could explain them. The employee who took the order described an adult female voice directing delivery to the back. The juvenile's account was admitted with the required safeguards. The relative authenticated the recording. Jurors heard about a timeline that ran like a ledger: call in, ticket out, driver assigned, driver gone. One choice by the court shaped what would come next. Chad Cobb, already serving life without parole for the killing, testified remotely. The defense objected on confrontation grounds. The court allowed video testimony given the emergency conditions. On the page, the state's case had weight. Systems matched to statements, statements bound to times. The defense pushed the question of reliability and challenged whether a phone call, even if proven, met the threshold for complicity in aggravated murder. Jury instructions focused on Ohio's law of aiding and abetting, what it means to purposely facilitate a crime and how an act like a lure can be treated as a substantial factor. When the panel returned, it found Erica Stefanko guilty of aggravated murder and murder. Judgment was entered. From an investigative standpoint, the case that began with a delivery ticket now carried 2 convictions, one for the person who killed, one for the person the state said engineered the setup. But process matters. The decision to allow remote testimony did not end with a gavel. It created a legal question that would dominate the next phase. In a serious felony trial, when can a witness appear by video without violating the defendant's confrontation rights? That is not a technicality. It is a constitutional line. The state had a verdict. The defense had a live appellate issue. The same evidence would soon be re-examined through that lens. After the 2020 verdict against Erica Stefanko, the case moved from facts to procedure. The evidence was familiar. Phone records matched the point-of-sale ticket, a late order under a false name, a service entrance drop at a closed address, and an autopsy that fixed ligature strangulation after pre-death control. But a constitutional issue sat in the middle of that trial. The court allowed Chad Cobb, already serving life without parole for killing Ashley Biggs, to testify by video during the pandemic. The defense argued that remote testimony undercut confrontation rights. In July 2022, Ohio's 9th District agreed and reversed the convictions. It wasn't a finding of innocence, it was a directive to do it right. Prosecutors rebuilt for a second trial without reinventing the story. The spine remained intact, the call that engineered isolation at the New Franklin rear threshold, the assault there, transport to the Chippewa Township field, a timeline that locked to carrier data and store systems. What changed was delivery. Witnesses appeared in person. The juvenile who had reported overhearing an adult woman place a late-night pizza order under a different name testified with the required safeguards. A relative authenticated the recording that referenced the order and post-offense talk with chain of custody laid out step by step. And under oath, Erica Stefanko acknowledged she placed the pizza order but denied involvement in the killing. The question before the jury was not who strangled Ashley. Cobb's 2013 plea already settled that. The question was facilitation. Did placing that call, with those instructions, purposely help set the homicide in motion? On January 31, 2024, the jury answered yes and returned guilty. The next day, February 1, 2024, the court imposed life imprisonment with parole eligibility after 30 years. The ruling closed the loop the law cares about. The killer is accountable. The person who engineered the lure is accountable. And the evidence that got both there is admissible, tested, and constitutional. No split endings, no parallel narratives. One case. The last unresolved motion came from Cobb. In July 2025, he asked to withdraw the 2013 guilty plea. A Summit County judge denied it. That left the legal posture as of September 16, 2025, clear and final. Cobb, life without parole. Stefanko, life with parole eligibility after 30 years. The locations never changed. Scene 1 was the New Franklin service entrance with blood evidence and no body. Scene 2 was the field in Chippewa Township, Wayne County, where Ashley was recovered. The method never changed. Pre-death control with a conducted electrical device and zip-tie ligature strangulation. The means of proof never changed. Systems that don't forget, witnesses who could be confronted in open court, and physical findings that fit the timeline. There is a practical takeaway that belongs to everyone who works nights. A caller who dictates terrain can remove ordinary protections. Policies help, two-person verification for rear door drops at closed sites, lighting that puts the handoff in public view, clear authority for drivers to decline unsafe instructions. Those are not abstractions. They come from exactly what happened here. And there is a second point that belongs to the justice system. Process is not a loophole. It is the way verdicts survive. The 2022 reversal did not erase the case. It forced a retrial that cured the defect, and the 2024 jury reached the same result on a sound record. Ashley Biggs was a veteran, a mother, and a reliable night shift worker who followed an order that was designed to isolate her. Telling her story with precision is a form of respect. It prevents confusion, stops drift, and keeps the focus where it belongs. A targeted lure, a killing proven by forensics and timestamps, and a courtroom outcome that now stands. Both defendants remain incarcerated in Ohio, USA. Chad Cobb on life without parole, Erica Stefanko on life with parole eligibility after 30 years. That is the single ending of this case. Looking back on Ashley's case, I realize how quickly an ordinary night can turn into something no one ever recovers from. For me, the lesson is clear. Safety should never be taken for granted, and accountability must always follow those who choose harm. Stories like this remind us that justice can take time, but persistence matters, and it sends a message that no life is disposable. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What lessons do you take from this case? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if this video resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story we share together.